If you were brought up in a prime minister's household or a president's household or a king or queen's, research would suggest you have a good relationship with power. You talked about power. You have healthy ideas about power, generally speaking. Those of us that weren't have very negative ideas about power. And so as a result of that, even if we were given language, we're like, oh no, power is something to avoid because it'll do something bad.
Hi, Andrea.
Hi, Amanda.
Welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
Of course. I'm really excited to have you on today. You have such a, I feel like, deep, like, interesting kind of background and your work around power specifically, and then also, like, affordable housing and all this stuff is just so fascinating. So I can't wait to dive in today.
Yeah, no, I'm excited. Although it's funny, I often say, like, if I had to do it all over again, I'd probably do, like, one thing because I hate writing bios or whatever. Like, I feel really blessed and grateful to have worked on so many different things, but it's hard to explain. Like, people want, like, the soundbite, right? And I don't always have that.
I mean, but don't you think that, like, because you're so, like, multifaceted, it's really, like, informed and sort of helped you be, like, the culmination of who you are today?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But it doesn't, I'm trying to smash the box so it makes sense, right? That I would be not in a box.
Yeah.
But when I need to get in the box to try and make change happen, it can be hard to fit in it for sure.
Yeah, but putting in boxes
it's
no
a good
fun.
Trade-off. I'm okay with it. I'm totally okay with it.
I also have, like, a very, like, weird background. Like, I studied film in university.
Okay.
Yeah. It's like, I'm not doing anything related to film, I guess,
Well,
besides,
here
like,
we
filming
are.
here. Yeah. Someone else is filming, though, not me.
What led you to study film? What was the motivation?
Oh, I just really love film. Like, I don't know. Like, I'm a big film buff, I guess you would say.
Yeah.
I find it really, like, magical. I get, like, getting lost. Like, I go to movies by myself. Like, I'm that weirdo.
I'm also that weirdo.
Yeah.
I took a course. I had this fellowship at Harvard and took a course on creating visual narratives of place. And it's the first time I'd learned. Well, let me rewind a bit. My first love in life was a cameraman on movies. So I sort of saw it through his eyes. But it was the first time I'd really had any formal training on it. And oh my God, it was so amazing. I had this whole grand theory of change about how we could, instead of having public hearings, for example, we could have, like, people create videos and, like, visual stories about what they loved about their communities, because it is so much more powerful for people.
It really is. I mean, like, if you think about a lot of the way that politics has changed because of visuals.
Yeah.
Like, I should have done some studying up. There was one president that, like, played really well in front of the camera, and it was, like, before, because it used to all be radio, and everyone just had to have, like, a really good voice. But then once they started putting people on camera, it just, like, didn't, like, everyone started, like, gravitating towards the person that had more of a presence or, like, was, like, more button, like, that looked nicer. Versus, like, it just, like, it's very important to people to be able to, like, see things in front of them. And I think that that's, like, a lot more powerful than you could ever imagine, is having, like, good visual aids.
Yeah, but, look at the mayors elect in Seattle and New York, perhaps mayors by the time people see this.
Yeah.
They're not, like, classic kind of made for TV folks, right?
No.
So I think there is an interesting, like, nerdcore and the rise of
Totally.
the policy wonk, the, like, person at the ground level. I think that's maybe starting to become a thing.
Yeah, like, Zoran, I think he's one of the first politicians to have a beard.
Wow. Okay. And believe it or not, like, so there was a debate many years ago, a national televised debate during a federal election in Canada. And I noticed that all four of the leaders on the debate had blue or green eyes. And I was like, that's weird. And so I went back, because I'm that nerd, did the research and went back like 50 years, as far back as you could go.
Right.
And the number of people with blue eyes and then a few with green versus brown eyes was fun, like just way out of whack to the regular kind of ratio you would expect in the public. And it's not just about like, it's incredible that even within the broad category of white, like dominant culture, that it's that pronounced. It's not just white, but like the most distilled form of Aryan white culture.
Yeah, which it's odd because like blue eyes are really uncommon.
Yeah, they are.
It's recessive,
I can't remember.
isn't it?
Yeah, I can't remember the stats, but it is incredibly uncommon. Brown is by far the dominant.
I think it's 1 in 4. Is it 1 in 4 recessive? Anyway, whatever. I'm no scientist.
High school genetics.
I did love genetics in high school. Well, great. I guess like I want to first kind of start from the beginning. So give us a little bit of storytelling about like maybe your childhood.
Oh gosh, my childhood. Yeah, we're going way back. I was born in central Saskatchewan in Treaty 6 territory. I was fostered out and adopted by a family who were from the coast here. So that's sort of how I always make a joke that I'm a 5th generation British Columbia born in Saskatchewan. So this connection. My birth family has a very long history of displacement, and I feel like my life has been kind of a story of a lot of displacement too, and that's just when they talk about intergenerational trauma, there's also there's other intergenerational things, right? So intergenerational displacement, but also intergenerational strength. Like I've met my birth family now. I've been getting to know them over the last, it's been probably 6 or 7 years now. I mean, the pandemic and a few other things kind of have made it a bit challenging because they're all back in the Saskatchewan, Alberta.
Sure.
But yeah, they are very strong people who have survived a tremendous amount. And then my adopted family, the people I think of as like my family, they also came from extremely humble, challenging working class backgrounds. And the more I've gotten to know my birth family, the more it sort of helped illuminate those parts of my adopted family's past and given some more texture to the childhood that I had, like the kind of desperation that they probably felt that I didn't hear articulated, but came through in behaviors that were a little bit outside what other people in my family or in my friend circle were experiencing. So the long and the short of it is I left home pretty early for a variety of reasons and spent a number of years living on the streets and being using drugs and doing the things that you do when you're street involved. And through that, really a lot of the things that I'd seen growing up, like we rarely had new clothes. It was just like in the communities we lived in, people babysat for each other, people shared clothes, people shared food, people that's how you got things done, right? In the absence of a broader public policy framework about how to make those things happen for people who were living lower income. And so the idea of community organizing was not really new to me. My mother would never refer to herself as a community organizer.
No, that's like a very new age term, I feel. I say I'm a community builder and I'm like, that is just, once it's a touch too far, I feel sometimes, because the people have been doing it for ages.
They have totally been doing it. We've just given it new language,
that's
right? I recently got an award for being an affordable housing champion. And I remember when I started doing that work, I was just someone fighting for housing and fighting for my friends to have housing.
Right.
I got called a foodie when I first got elected. And I'm like, I was just hungry. I had a lot of friends who were hungry. I never really thought of it as a thing.
Yeah.
But it is a thing. And I have come to realize over time that the communities that traditionally and identities that traditionally have been left out of what we would consider power, like power holding people, we need those people as allies. If we don't have them as allies, we're never going to build the power that we need to make change happen. And it's because of allies from those communities that we've been able to make change. And so, where I might have seen it as an us and them when I was younger, I see it very much as an us now. And how do we figure out how to build bridges rather than create what are often artificial distinctions. But don't get me wrong, there are people who really are never going to see themselves as an us. It's always about them and pulling resources towards themselves. But I think the vast majority of people want to live in communities that are strong, with families that are healthy, and to have personal connections that are enriching and nourishing, right? These don't seem like big asks, but I think they've become harder and harder.
Yeah. I mean, like, that's a really, like, holistic and nice way to think about the community at large, you know, people that aren't necessarily, like, within our immediate circles. Can you pinpoint, like, a time when that shifted for you? Because I think, like, it's so easy for us to get really siloed into whatever echo chamber of politics or ideologies that we're invested in without, I mean, like, social media really helps with that, right? It, like, tunnels us in. We don't hear anything from the outside. We don't hear about other people's experiences or perspectives on purpose. And it just, like, all it does is, like, inform our thoughts. And I guess, like, yeah, I'm curious if there was, like, a point of time in your upbringing, or, like, as you've lived your life, it could have been, like, recent, I guess, where you feel like maybe you've become a little bit more, like, understanding of everybody's, like, struggles and how we're just all human.
Yeah, it's such a good question. I think I've probably always been inclined in that direction, even if it didn't. My mother's going to hear this and just burst out laughing. But I'm very passionate. I feel injustice quite keenly. I used to make jokes that, like, oh, I'm adopted because my parents have expressed their organizing and their community work a lot differently. Like, the concept of being in front of a microphone is probably more startling to them than the idea of me leaving home in my teens.
Funny.
And, like, yeah, because they left home in their teens.
Sure.
And they did a lot of, survival things to try and make it work in their situations. But the idea of standing in front of microphones and, like, raising your fist and trying to like push people and propel policies forward is something outside of their experience. And they're both introverted. My father's actually passed on, my adopted father, but he was very introverted. My mom's very introverted. But I've realized now, connecting with my birth family, I have this long history of activists, folks who fought in the Métis uprisings all across the country, Cree family that were very involved in politics. My great uncle was the first Indigenous senator in Canada. Like, whoa. It's just, yeah, it's a very, so you talk about intergenerational, right?
Yeah, like, you're like, it's in my blood.
Yeah. And I think, like, the passion is in my blood, and the belief that just because things are a certain way doesn't mean they have to be that way. This idea about working with others, I think when you grow up, I was even kind of a marginalized identity, even with my own family, right? Growing up. I have an adopted brother, but he's very clearly white, and, he's a guy.
White passing,
yeah, he's great. He's an amazing human, and I'm really grateful that we were brought together, but we have very different, people would perceive us very differently. So I think when that happens, and I suspect you've had some experiences like this yourself, you become very observant when you know that spaces you're walking into can be erratically unsafe, but in an unpredictable way, right? They may seem fine, and then suddenly they're not, right? People say something or do something, or you get treated in a way that's different than other people.
Sure.
You just learn to be very observant. You don't come in with your elbows out. I think when I was quite young, I did that and would crash a lot and just learned over time that it was better and safer to watch and listen. And when you do that, you start to see that the noise, it's interesting, we were talking about film earlier, the visuals and the noise can mask ultimately, it comes down to how people are feeling, right? And if you can really kind of pull back and see how they're feeling, a lot of the times we're all feeling the same, right? We're scared, or we're, I mentioned desperation earlier, we're desperate, or we're elated, or we're protecting someone we love, or, we just want, we feel like we've been treated unfairly and we just want fairness, right?
Right.
And when you can connect to people at that level, you realize that you can work together to find solutions. Like, maybe you aren't right all the time, right?
Sure.
And maybe they're not wrong all the time. And maybe somewhere in the middle, there's a solution.
It's always somewhere in the middle.
So the challenge, I think, comes down to human rights issues, where I have a trans kid, and I was at a school board meeting many years ago where they were fighting for, they were part of the original group of students who fought for just what I would consider very basic safety in high schools in Vancouver schools, but high schools in this case. And one of the trustees said, well, can't we just meet halfway on this? And I'm thinking, like, what's the halfway? Like, they're half a person, or like what?
I mean, that's what it used to be like.
Yeah. And so I think for many issues, climate change, healthcare,
Sure.
housing, like there's ways to meet people's needs, and then let's talk about wants, right? On human rights, it's the lines are harder, and so it becomes harder to find those halfways. And I think when you look at the really big cleavage points in our society right now, they often come down to issues of human rights and survival.
I totally agree. And I think that it's unfortunate because it's like, we're not asking for a lot. Like, it's like Black Lives Matter. It's like, we're literally not even asking for anything. It's just that we want you to recognize that we matter. It's not even like that much of like, it's not a hyperbolic thing to say. So from my perspective, if I wanted to be, I don't know, like to try to see where other people are coming from when they're being so unwilling to accept different people from them, I think it's just ignorance and like not understanding, because like for them, they're so deep in their perspective or the way that they've been taught about things that like the idea of being trans or like the idea of being around people that are trans or that are openly trans is like extremely jarring and like scary for them, and they're reacting in a way that is like violent and or like exclusive, which is unfortunate, and I don't like it. Obviously very not okay with anyone reacting that way, but it's like I think people are just scared.
Yeah. And well, so if you can figure out like, and I can say this, and then I'll also say like I find it very hard to practice around certain issues, trans being one of them.
Of course.
But to really try and drill down into what scares you about this. Like, is it threatening your security? Is it threatening your survival? Is it threatening your children? Like these sort of things that people hold so dearly, they're willing to hurt someone else to get there.
I think it's like an identity thing. It's like they're like so worried about that being the one thing that they know to be true in their life to be shaken up. Right. These like constructs, like gender and, all these isms that we live in. If that isn't true, then what else isn't true? And
Right.
like, who am I? And like, where do I stand in this? And what is that? What do they want from me?
Well, so power. I need to see, I don't know how many minutes it's been, but it took us a while to get there. But here we are at power. One of the things that is universally true is that it's very important to us as humans to understand the power hierarchy that we're in and our place within it. And because power can be very dangerous if it's done to us, for example, it can be extremely dangerous. And most of us I can't think of anyone who wouldn't have an experience of being at the wrong side of bad power or at least in artful power being used against you, like weaponized. And so when we start to change the power structures, like in this case, men are dominant, women are less dominant. Let's say, I was trying to use the word submissive, but I can't. Yeah. Most women I know are not submissive.
No, not at all. This is a wrong place for that.
Yeah. But in a global kind of context, we sort of look at it that way, sure. that men have the patriarchy, if we want to call it that, like has a lot of power on planet Earth, right? So this idea of, maybe that's wrong really threatens some people, men for sure, but also women who may not like being second, but the idea that they might now be third or fourth or fifth or who even knows, right? Like right. That could be very scary for
right.
them.
That's so true. So you've done, so I just want to make sure we inform our listeners and watchers, but like you've done actual academic work around the idea of power, but I want to make sure that we're giving them the whole story here. So
yeah, for sure.
I mean, like, obviously your childhood had a huge impact on like the work that you do and the perspectives that you have. It sounds like it was very like you had a lot of different perspectives because you lived in a lot of different environments and sort of like experienced a lot of different facets of society from different perspectives. What kind of learner are you?
Such a good question. Many teachers have asked this question. Yeah, I mean, I'm pretty voracious. Like, I just am like a bit of a learning machine, and I will look at problems from like 100 different ways. If
It's
I
always been
can.
like that for you?
Yeah, absolutely.
You're like one of those kids that just like would ask like a million questions. I love that.
Yeah, much to the annoyance of my introverted parents. My dad once offered me, and like this was in the 1970s, $5 to stop talking for an hour.
You're like, no deal.
I absolutely took the deal. Yeah, no, it was, yeah, I had a very voracious learning appetite. I will say both of my adoptive parents were quite, you know, even if they didn't always appreciate the verbal questions, really themselves are both brilliant people in their own rights in different fields, including the field of survival and community organizing, because that was the vehicle to survival. But also my dad was a butcher. He left high school. He never made it to high school, actually. He left school. His family is Mennonite, and there was in Orthodox Mennonite communities at that time, the belief was that if you educated yourself beyond a certain level, you were putting yourself ahead of God. And so he left school at the age of 13 and took a train from Manitoba, from the Mennonite community he lived in, to the coast to live with his sisters. Got a job apprenticing as a butcher at Fraser and Broadway in the old Super Value, and worked as a butcher for quite a number of years.
Wow.
Then he got a job with, I think it was called U.S. Borax. It was a chemical company, and he sprayed chemicals on weeds on trains, which is how he met my mom. He was in a community that she lived in at the time. And my mom, like, she started working at the age of 10 in the tea house in the community. She grew up on Bowen Island, and had to leave the community. She had to work full time, leave Bowen Island because there was no high school there. And
Still isn't.
She wanted to go to high school, and at that time they didn't send you, and you were done. It was a really poor community at the time.
Wow, how much has it changed since then?
Well, in that there was a resort on the island. My grandfather ran the ferry that would go back and forth to the resort,
No
which
way.
eventually became the ferry. And my mom, Union Steamship, was like that was the company that owned the
No
resort
kidding.
and the tea shop. And
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Had no idea.
Yeah, no, it's a super fascinating
It
little.
is so fascinating.
But the people who actually lived on Bowen before
Yeah.
the resort was built, they were very, like, their not homesteaders makes it sound glamorous. They lived in shack. I mean, my mom took out a picture to show my nephews of the house she grew up in on Bowen, and the boys and her friend who was over were like, "Where'd you get that from?" And she's like, "That's where I grew up." And her friend from Germany who was looking at was like, "You lived there?" Like, and yet for her, we went some years ago. Okay, I feel like the Metro Van Regional District's about to knock on my door. But some years ago, we went to Bowen, hopped a fence because it's now part of the water district area, and went and saw like the remains of this shack that she used to live in on this lake. Anyway, the point is they were very poor.
Yes.
Like, much poorer than many of the circumstances people would find. Like, in those days, you could get that poor, right? And so they figured out how to work their way. Although the other thing also in those days, you could work your way. You had a shot at getting ahead, right? Because wages and cost of living were a little bit closer together. So you could work they worked incredible hours through my whole life. And I think before I was there, like, even much more so. My mom put my dad through to get his high school degree as an adult, and then through UBC, and then he worked and put her through school and she got her degree. So he became an agronomist, a soil scientist, and my mom became a geophysicist. And they, like, when our family holidays were often like work trips, but we'd also like go learn about rocks, right? Or go learn about soil, or we'd go on hikes. And my dad would teach me about the ecology of a place.
Right.
Or I mean, we wouldn't have used those kind of terms at the time. But
No, but I mean, I gave you kind of like it sort of was like an open-minded,
Yeah.
it primed your brain to be able to like receive a lot of different kinds of things.
Absolutely. And I've had phenomenal teachers, both like informal, like in the classroom, but also just folks, family, friends. I mean, the other part of this is that we were being looked after by other people often, right? Because my parents both worked a lot. We had babysitters. Through the babysitters, they had networks of friends.
Right.
And so, yeah, it was a different time. You know, the more we're talking, the more I'm realizing like social media, TV, streaming services, we spend so much more time alone now. Like I remember being at babysitters' houses where, you know, their adult friends would come over with their kids and we'd all play together. It just wasn't like babysitting. It just was Tuesday afternoon, right? It's what you
Hang
did
out
together. Yeah. It wasn't a play date. It just was
same.
a thing,
Yeah.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think like we have become far more isolated, obviously, in our society these days. Like it's like there's too many opportunities for convenience over like human interaction.
Yeah. And scheduling and like it's all
it's a lot.
Yeah.
And I also feel the same way, even though like I think we're different generations, but it's just kind of like, you know, we used to just like hang out with people and it was like all we really had. I think my generation was the last one to know what a time before the internet existed.
Right. It's true. My kid, we have a picture. My ex-husband's father was a journalist and wrote a story about my kid with this picture that became quite famous of them at 2 with their thumb in their mouth and their hand on a mouse, staring at a computer, doing an educational game on the computer. But funny. Like, that's how they grew up, right?
Yeah.
They're 28 now, but like, so that's a long time as a species that we've had this access to all of it. I guess it's definitely not evenly spread across the world.
I mean, it's kind of also short. I mean, if you think about it, it's like only been like a solid less than 30 years of like how far we've come. It's scary. It's very fast.
Yeah, it is a bit scary. And obviously we haven't kept up in terms of regulating or discussing like the morals or ethics of it.
Absolutely not. Yeah, absolutely not. So when do you feel like, I feel like the terminology like feminist awakening is a bit like, but like when do you feel like you started to like get it when it comes to feminism?
Oh, interesting. I mean, I grew up in the one thing my mom would always attach herself to is the word feminist.
That's really unusual.
Well, and especially at that time.
That's what I mean. Yeah.
She was born in 1937.
Holy cow.
She's not young. Sorry, Mom.
But what a trailblazer. Yeah. Like, I mean, like the term feminist was like, I mean, it still is like kind of a dirty word. Yeah.
No, she was... You know, and my dad, who definitely, like, as noted, Mennonite, grew up in a very traditional household. He didn't tolerate it. Like, he openly embraced my mom's work on feminists. Was my father a feminist? Good question. I don't know what I would say to that. I think he was a product of his environment, right? I think he was as feminist as he could be for a man who was born in 1936 in rural Manitoba in a Mennonite community with like there was a lot about his life that but he was more than tolerant of it. I think he made a lot of space for it. At the same time, like on the weekend and in the evenings, my brother did the boy chores and I did the girl chores, right? And so but my mom, when I was in, I think it was grade 7, it's a bit of a long backstory, but the summary highlights, you asked me what kind of learner I was. At a particular point in my education, they opened up experimental school for gifted children in Calgary, where I was living at the time. What could go wrong?
Yeah, right? I'm like, that sounds sus already right off the back.
So they threw me in there thinking like, it was just super interesting. experience to go through that. There were definitely kids, like as I look back on it now, I wouldn't have been able to diagnose it at the time, but kids who were overachievers who totally crashed in that environment because there was no structure, no grades, you were completely independent.
I see.
I was like kid in a candy store. I loved it. Like we started a computer company. We sold games on floppy disk, like coded them all and sold them. We built robots. And then I got kicked out. Well, that's not fair. I'm pretty sure my parents like pulled me out, but I was going off campus a lot. It was near downtown. I was going off campus a lot.
You're just like, I'm a free spirit. I do what I want.
They were high school. Like it was embedded in a high school, and I was hanging out more with high school kids. And anyway, it was... things were happening.
Sure.
Anyway, I got pulled out of there and put into the regular, whatever you will call it, like the school system. And I got my timetable, and the timetable said I had to take home economics. Couldn't take so at that time, girls were streamed into home economics and boys were streamed into shop. So my mom finds out about this and she's like, that's great. And so she marches down to the school. She takes time off work, which like never happened.
Wow.
And marches down to the school with me the next morning and insists that I be allowed to take shop. So I become the first girl to ever take shop, which was, it backfired on me. I mean, I wasn't pushing for any of
like how did you feel about that though? Like were you just kind of like, okay, mom, I guess like if this is the hill you want to die on, like I don't really care, but
yeah.
Did you care?
We didn't really have that kind of relationship.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, like there wasn't the kind of home you would speak back to your parents.
Oh, no, I didn't think you would. I'm just kind of like, I just was curious like how you felt in that because like you obviously were absorbing this action that she was taking, which was like, I'm standing up for my daughter and like being like, she doesn't have to do that.
Yeah.
And you're kind of just like, I mean, as a kid, I remember what that was like. You're just doing what you're told. You're following the rules. So you're doing what you're supposed to. And then she was like, we're not following the rules.
Yeah, it's such a good question. Like in retrospect, I have a lot of respect for it because like,
of course.
Well, and knowing who she is, how like for her to go in and like be like, like camp out in the principal's office being like, no, I'm getting a meeting today and here's the outcome that is going to happen.
Like while that was happening, were you like, oh, this is a big deal. Mom took off work and stuff?
The taking off work, I remember talking to my brother. We're both like, whoa, that's big,
she is
like,
pissed.
What's gonna, yeah, exactly. There was another time when I was in kindergarten. My brother was in grade 1. We came home and we're debating a part of the Lord's Prayer that we learned in a new school. We moved quite a bit as kids. And my mom overheard it. And she's like, what are you talking about? And we're like, well, we didn't really understand this part. And she's like, and so she took a day off to go in and explain to the school that church and state are separate and you can't teach children the Lord's Prayer. And anyway.
I love it.
She definitely, like, she sounds like such a bold, badass activist, and she was, but those were like the 2 times in my whole life that I remember her doing it in a kind of overt way. But yeah, she was definitely a feminist. So what was the outshot of the shop discussion?
Well, I mean, that was like maybe one of the moments that informed
for sure
your like feminist sort of perspective.
Well, so what happened, the home ec teacher passed me in the hall one day and called me a and the shop teacher had no idea what to do with me. And he would like do everything for me and then give me excellent grades. Like I'd be like, even drafting. Like drafting is not a dangerous activity.
Right, yeah.
Anyway, it was a learning experience for everyone. But I think like, so I definitely got the feminist perspective out of that. But the other thing I got out of that was that winning isn't always winning, right? And that you need to kind of think chess moves ahead. Would I have done it differently? Probably not, because I didn't have a lot of say in it one way or the other.
Sure.
I already was in a lot of trouble at home from being kicked out. Like, right. I wasn't willing to fight one more battle, but it was a good learning experience about how battling, like hurtling yourself head on to things maybe isn't always the strategic way to make change happen.
Choose your battles.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Although after that, subsequently, every generation every next class, they had to do half and half. So, yeah.
Wow.
So clearly
Thanks,
the
Mom.
principal didn't want to deal with that again, right? So
yeah, the principal's like, that woman is going to come back here.
Yeah, exactly. We don't want to deal with her. So yeah. My mom also, I didn't know it at the time, but I found out years later, at the time in Canada in the 70s, there was a national action committee on the status of women. NAC was the National Action Committee was the acronym. And my mom and a woman she worked with at BC Hydro, she was a punch card operator at BC Hydro at the time.
Punch card operator.
Yeah. So there was a union, but the pay bands only applied to the men, not to the women. And so they wanted to be part of that. And so they
should, yeah.
Yeah. So they negotiated this whole thing. And actually, so what they ended up doing, BC Hydro had these, I think it was numbered pay grades for the men. And then they gave the women alphabetical ones. So they had a pay grade, but it started lower and ended much lower than the men. But at least it started getting them into the system.
Sure.
Right. Yeah. So she definitely, and wrote this big submission about it to the National Action Committee, which had a lot of impact, right? Because there weren't women at the time who had the time, the energy, the willingness. I asked my mom if I could see the presentation, and I mean, this is the 70s. It's all typewritten.
Right.
They had to hand do the graphs about wages and stuff. It's pretty. And then they were raising kids and working full time and still carrying a lot of the household burden of cooking and cleaning and all of these things, right? And trying to change the world all at the same time. So yeah, feminism I come by pretty honestly. My grandma, my mom's mom, was she moved away from her husband and lived on her own with kids at a time when nobody did that, in the 40s. So
it seems like it was such a ingrained part of the culture of your family.
Yeah.
It was never called out because it was just this is just the way that things are and this is how we do things.
This is what's going to happen.
Yeah, and it never was we're hardcore feminists. Can you imagine?
Yeah. I think there's people who grew up in families
for sure. I mean, especially now. But I feel like it also gives me hope because hearing stories about the way that feminism has moved forward in the past with the constraints that they had that you just mentioned, the work doesn't stop.
Oh, no. In fact, it's just always, it's it really is an onion. You get through one layer and you're yay. And you're oh, okay. I see what's at this next layer.
Yeah. There's a lot, but it's I think that there's a bit of despair within the community, or my generation anyway, that I see where people are what are we going to do? Ever since Roe versus Wade was overturned, it's been very dark, which is that we're what are we gonna do? This is crazy. We never thought that this would happen, and we don't have. I personally feel there's there's a disconnect, a chasm between generations because our Western society doesn't really necessarily value women of a certain age or that are older that have these these amazing stories of how they dealt with oppression and pushed feminism forward, and they don't share those stories. So now I feel there's a bit of what do we do? How are we going to do any of this under these circumstances? And then I hear stories like this and it gives me a bit of hope because it's even if it's just a little bit, it's something. Going to your kid's school and saying something is huge, right? I mean, you don't know what that's going to do. And plus you grew up to be such a badass and you're working in politics and doing all this really amazing work. And it's not obviously a direct correlation, but it certainly informed who you are today.
Oh yeah, for sure. No question about it. I think that, I mean, one of the more challenging things is seeing the arc of history. And we have gotten, I think this concept of being ahistorical fluctuates in human history, but for a variety of reasons, we actually have, for some of the reasons you're speaking to, but other ones as well, even though we've never had as much technology to tell stories, we've never had less social connectivity to move, like the distribution for those stories, right? So I consider that when my mom was doing all that, she could not get a credit card with her own name on it, right? Like that happened.
I mean, recent.
Yeah.
That was recent. 70s, right? Was like when it...
80s.
Sorry, it was 80s when it changed. Yeah.
Yeah,
oh
exactly. I remember seeing her credit card and being like, why is Dad's name on that? And she's like, well, Andrea, like I'm a woman and I can't. And I was like, oh, which also was really important, right? To see that, like, well, certain things were moving forward. Very structural things were going to be barriers for me, right? Like things that just seemed, especially growing up in the household I grew up in, I kind of thought, it never even occurred to me that those things would be hard until I was like, oh, I see. Abortion was legalized in my adult lifetime. Like I'm, somewhat old, but not that old, right?
No, yeah, you're not.
So Roe versus Wade, and Canada was even after that.
Sure.
We're not talking about a long time in human history that we've had access to this. So I think the more you can look back on history and see the gains we've made, the more you can sort of contextualize what feel like losses are part of a larger arc, right? That it's not all linear, that you're going to move forward and there's going to be a little down and then we move to up. And you see that throughout human history. There's no steady march to victory, right?
Oh, no, definitely not. Yeah. And it's very I mean, I think people say it repeats itself or whatever. But I think it just informs, history informs what's going to happen. So a lot of currently what's happening geopolitically, it's quite shocking to a lot of people. Not to say that it's not shocking, but I've talked to some sociologists and historians about it, and they actually have a pretty positive outlook on it. They're like, anytime you've seen a group of people oppressed by anything, something gives in. People will fight back. It's inevitable. And it gives me hope because it just seems so what the heck are we gonna do about this in this moment? Yeah. Speaking of tough times, I guess I wanted to ask about your work around power, because I think when I was when I brought this idea to bringing you onto the podcast, we talked a little bit about how you started to work around the idea of power, and it was maybe around the pandemic, you said, that you started to kind of think about this.
Yes and no.
I mean, it wasn't informed by the pandemic necessarily, but that was my rough transition into this discussion. So why don't you tell me a little bit about how you kind of decided to start thinking about that? I mean, this was obviously post your political, the height of your political career. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard for me to talk about it cleanly.
That's
because
okay.
as I look back on it retrospectively, I'm like, oh, this is so obvious now and this and that, but it wasn't at the time.
Sure.
So I think if I had to sort of see the progression, when I was in elected office, I had been elected for, let me just quickly count this up, 7, 8 plus 3. So I've been elected for about 12 years.
Yeah, I got it. Well, it says 2000. You were a city councilor from 2008 to 2018.
Yeah. And I'd been elected to school board in 2002. So had some different experiences of being elected. When I was elected to school board, I was all by myself. I was the first Green elected in Canada to office. So I was literally all by myself. Sure. And then when I was elected to council in 2008, I was with a big team that had a huge amount of momentum and wow, rock star mayor candidate and a ton of mandate from the public to move forward on big issues. So it was two very different experiences that were amazing in terms of learning about political power and how that works, or what I would call now positional power, having a title and the authority to do something with that title. but the thing is, I think when I was I worked in advocacy for many years, was an activist, an advocate, sat on just way too many boards for way too many issues, ranging from credit unions to farmers markets to childcare, democratic reform, you name it. Worked in environmental advocacy. So was working on like climate action and wilderness conservation and endangered species and all that. And was raising a young kid at the time when I was first elected. I really thought that having positional power was like the answer, like, writ large, let's carve it into stone here. This is the answer. We'll get, and I had always believed that. Like I saw from my parents' work that I mean, again, they would never refer to it that way, but from their lives, what they would refer to as their lives and their efforts to survive, and the way that when things were working well, they worked well because we were working together with other families and individuals in our community. Mm-hmm. And when they weren't working well, it's when we didn't have that connectivity, right? Mm-hmm. And I really understood from that organizing matters. And then once I was living on the streets, I increasingly saw that people who were elected were never going to agree. Like you could either keep electing what I would have thought of at the time as bad people and trying to convince them to do good things, sure, or you could just elect good people, right? It seemed very obvious to me. And so I mean, it took me a while to kind of figure out how we were going to elect good people. And again, I'm air quoting good and bad because as I'm about to get to, these binary terms, and we were talking about it earlier, they're not accurate. Anyway, so I ran for office. Well, got involved in politics, sort of ran for office by accident, but then I got elected and
you're like, now I have to do it.
Take backs on that, and you're doing it.
You apply for the job, you get the job. That's what it is.
Exactly. Well, in a job, you can be like, oh no.
Yeah, actually, I changed my mind. Yeah. Can you imagine? It's like, you all elected me, but I think you're wrong. So
didn't mean to. Sorry about that. Yeah. So I got elected and had to lean in. I mean, interestingly, when I was first elected, I was running a large organization, the largest membership-based environmental organization in Canada at the time. It was over $1 million in debt. I had a 5-year-old at home. I was 29. Was elected for the Green Party. Like it was a lot. And I would wake up in the morning, deal with kid stuff, get to work like, 8, 9, 10 hours, get on a bus, go to school board, sit through like 3 or 4 hours of evening meetings, and then go home, do email, and wake up 4 hours later and do the whole cycle all over again. So it was a lot. It was pretty intense. But one of the things that happened during that time was that during the day, and this was in the early 2000s, so we just had a legislature elected in BC that was 77 conservative-leaning MLAs and 2 progressives. And so we were battling hard, we were pushing, screaming at government in every way that we could. And then I'd go to school board in the evening, and the people who came to advocate to me, the screamers they're not who you listen to in government, right? Even when you agree fundamentally with them, even when they were allies, unions, folks that I'd worked with in community and who had supported my campaign, when they're screaming at you, it's really hard. You talk about seminal moments. These are, and then people who I fundamentally disagreed with at a number of levels on any number of things, public policy, just coming from different experiences, people who actively have run against me and would prefer I not be elected. They were much better at advocating than the folks that I had traditionally worked with. And definitely the screamers sounded a lot more like I did. And it really changed a lot about the way that I did my work. It was like being in this phenomenal laboratory where I, worked to convince a government to change its mind during the day. And at night was a government with people trying to convince me to change my mind about something or come to a decision that they would feel good about. And so that really changed how I was thinking about work. And so the other thing that happened was that I was alone, by myself. There was a progressive leaning government, a Cope government at the time who had the majority. And I would say there was some friction between us at the beginning because they didn't, the upstart new party and, shiny new object, and they wanted some attention themselves. And We found ways to work together, like good ways. I mean, I would say I'm quite close to them, became quite close to them over time. But what I did was a lot of pilot projects, like, because that's what I could do. Nobody
Sure.
wanted me to be able to do some big new, like, piece of policy. So I would do all these pilots. And then the next government got elected, and they I watched them rip all of that stuff out and just throw it away. And so if you think about pilot projects in government, it's kind of like grass. Lots of stuff above the ground, but really tiny roots below the ground. So when I got elected to council, I was like, I am growing trees here. Like, I'm going to grow the deepest roots I can. And maybe nobody sees anything above ground for a year or 2 or 3, but I want this to live much longer than I'm here in government. And so I really focused on that strategy. Anyway, fast forward to how I got involved in power. I mean, that's all about power, right?
Well, I mean, that's like interesting. That must have been such a weird moment for you to be like seeing people that fundamentally disagreed with you on a lot of like things that you care deeply about, but articulate it in a way that was so like captivating, I guess.
Yeah.
And then seeing people on your side of it not being able to communicate it in a way that was like helpful or coming from a place of like kindness or trying to level with people in a way like on a human level. So like that must have been kind of like disorienting for you.
It was, for sure. I mean, it led to a lot of realizations that
you're like, people are just people.
Yeah. And that, I would say became to understand that, like, when you're standing at a protest, and I'd been at a lot of protests in my time against whatever, some of you are there to fight against this thing because it's in the way of getting to where you want to go. And some of you are there because you're just against this thing. You don't have a bigger vision of where you want to go, right? And I hadn't really understood that about progressive movements until that time, that there's a big divide between those two groups.
And you find that to be maybe the determining factor for maybe like how much momentum you can get as a movement?
Absolutely. Like if you're not fighting for something, you are absolutely limiting the ability of people to join you in fighting for that. Like,
that's interesting.
Only so many people who want to fight against things, and it's a zero-sum game. Like, it's whack-a-mole. You can keep whacking these things down, but there's always going to be one more than you're going to have energy to go fight against, right? And so we were talking about your generation feeling like they're losing because they're playing whack-a-mole, right? Like, where are you trying to go? Where do you want to get to?
Right.
Not just as an absence of going in the direction we seem to be on, but like, what is the articulated vision?
Yeah, like I have a real issue sometimes. Like I'm chronically online, so I see a lot of crazy stuff come across like my social media, but there's a lot of fighting amongst us, like people that are supposed to be on the same side. A lot of bickering, and whatever crisis is happening at that time, it's not like, let's fight for to make the crisis better. A lot of it is like, I'm gonna yell at this other person that's on my side for not talking enough about the crisis.
Yeah.
And
or mentioning one piece of the crisis, but not the other 85 pieces in their 200 character tweet.
It drives me crazy because I mean, it's just, it's so presumptuous. It's so like, and it's almost like people get harangued for like being performative, but then if you're not performative enough, then you also get in trouble. So, it's like you can't win. And then what happens? People feel like they can't do anything because they're like, I can't do anything right. Yeah. And so then you're just kind of like, I'm just going to stay silent, which is obviously never the answer. You shouldn't. So anyway,
It's a great springboard, though, to the power discussion.
Yes.
Because what I came to see or feel, I think I felt it at the time. It wasn't until having the time to reflect on it and study it academically that I sort of understood what was happening. But what I felt like was that, between that divide, the people who are fighting something because it's in the way of their ultimate vision or goal
Sure.
versus those who are just fighting.
Right.
The people who are just fighting, oftentimes, and I wouldn't say always, it's not universal, but oftentimes they're victims. They have a victimized identity, and they need something to victimize them in order to validate their own identity.
Right.
So if you think about it in power terms, they feel powerless or lower power at least. And they want to prove that by showing that something has more power than them, right? And so it becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy that they fight against something that's too big to fight with this low power, and then they lose. And so now they've been validated that they're powerless or they're a victim, and this cycle just keeps repeating itself. So it's why I felt like, well, it's one of the many reasons, but it definitely played a strong role in my feeling that power literacy was something that we needed to start working on. So I did time in public office. I was starting to see the limits of what I'll refer to as positional power, like having that title and being in elected office. Part of that was structural. Part of it was being a woman, that I definitely hit a moment of realizing, I think probably a conservative woman, but definitely not a progressive woman, and definitely not a progressive woman with like sex worker, drug user, homeless person, Indigenous woman in their bio was going to be mayor anytime soon, or have like, I would always depend on a strong ally in that position to be able to get stuff done. And while I had one at the time, it'd been 10 years and I felt like that was kind of on a pathway that I wanted to sort of go in a different direction. But the really big thing was Donald Trump. When he got elected in 2016, all of my faith and belief that democracy was the pathway out of inequality, the pathway out of climate disaster, the pathway out of injustices ranging from colonization to different things that have happened structurally around racism and like you name it. I was like, maybe shook. This isn't the way. Like, if this can happen, if this can be an outcome of the system, something has to be wrong with the system. And being inside the system, it'd be like being inside a corporation and realizing something's fundamentally wrong and trying to stay inside and see it, right? And so I was like, okay, I'm not going to run again. I'm going to take a break. I'll be straight up. I was at pretty much a physical exhaustion limit too. Like, I'd really put like 180% of myself into elected office, partially because someone like me doesn't get there like really ever. So why?
So you had to like, you had to claw your way in there and like stay there.
And you're there on behalf of like, so for me, I'm representing like millions of people whose voices don't get heard in government. And I'm not trying to say it with hubris. I'm saying they get one, right? Whereas I'm forgetting the stats, but something like 40% of the comments that were spoken in the House of Commons at the time, Riley Yo, who was with Open Media at the time, she did this study. She's like, 40% of the comments made in the House of Commons are made not just by white men, but by men named Stephen, Robert, or John, right? And so Stephen, Robert, or John get a lot of representation and, folks who own homes and have university degrees and grew up in middle-class house or above households and, have a certain level of privilege. Not to say I don't, but a higher level of privilege, they get a lot of representation. So I felt like I had to work very hard to try and just make room for, it wasn't about using my voice. It was about using my power to try and make space and room for other people's voices. Anyway, I was pretty tired trying to hold that up. And so I decided not to run again. I had no idea what I was going to do and thought that teaching might be an interesting way to try. I don't have a university degree, so this wasn't sort of a naturally obvious thing. So I talked to a friend who was head of the public policy school at UBC at the time and was like, hey, Maura, her name's Maura Coyle. She's amazing. One of the many mentors I've had over my life. And she's like, I kind of laid out what I wanted to do, which basically was like, a very embryonic version of what I do now. Like, kind of like to talk to people about how government works and like why yelling at it's not such a great idea and like some other ways that you can shift power and systems to make big changes happen. And she's like, well, that's great. But if that's what you want to do, you should really apply for this fellowship. And I'm like, I don't really know what a fellowship is, but it sounds academic-y. And I'm...
Sure, I can be a fellow. Let's do it.
Yeah. So she sent me the forms. So the fellowship's at Harvard University. And I was like, Maura, like, I just don't think this is going to happen. Like, I can fill it out and send it in, but will you give me the job? Like,
it's like a true like Elle Woods moment. You were just like,
why not?
How hard could it be?
So I fill it in. And I get the call that I've been shortlisted. And I was like, exactly. And I was like, oh, God, like, this is a lot, right? But you don't, like, you can't, it's like being elected. Well, I mean, I could have actually said no in this case, but the chances of you saying no are fairly small. So I go through the interview and I'm like, okay. And then I get a call. Well, I'm on stage giving a talk and actually leave the stage because it says Harvard University on my phone. I'm like, I just need to take a call.
1 second, please.
And I go and take the call, get it. I'm crying when I get back on the thing, on the stage. And that's great. And so then they want me to go for this orientation. Sorry, I'm way off topic now. But
that's cool. No, this is so fascinating to me.
So I'm in council and I'm trying to get I think I was chairing council that day. I'm trying to get the meeting done. So
you're like, I got things to do. I got to go.
So I get on the plane. It's fine. I get to Boston. There's a weather delay out of, I think it was New York to Boston. Flew to New York, Boston. Okay. Weather delay. And I'm going to be late. And this time that I have to sit there while this thunderstorm's raging, I'm like, I can't do this. Like, there's no way I can do this. You get this thing in your head, like, I think Bad Academy, this is like what it's all about. I'm like, this is impossible. So I get on the plane to Boston and then I'm like, okay, well, I'll go change in the bathroom because I've got like jeans and a t-shirt on. But the bus is right there. It's like to like the one I got to get on. And I'm like, okay, well, I'll get on that. And I'll at the subway, and then the subway's right there. And so I get on the subway. I get off at Harvard Station and there's this picture of Harvard and I texted a friend. I'm like, I just don't think I can do this. Like, I'm just like, what would be the worst thing if I went up the stairs, got on the other track and went home? And he's texting me and he's like, well, think about that. Like, what would be the worst thing, right? But what would be the best thing if you actually just walked, right? So I walk and I show up in my jeans and a t-shirt because I had no time to change to Harvard, being like, hi, I'm here, ready to go. Everyone's like already like half drunk because I'm late because of the flights and whatever. And and you realize, oh my God, they're all terrified too.
They're just people.
There were people there with like 3 or 4 like master's degrees and they're also terrified and obviously very nervous. And it was really amazing. And really what a gift to have that year. So fast forward, I had originally written that what I wanted to study was not unlike the class. I want to be able to understand how democracy, and it's not like I have the corner on how democracy works, but I wanted to share what I understood about how democracy works well and what leads to it not working so well. But I very quickly understood, even in the first few weeks of being in Harvard, even like just from acceptance to getting there, that actually it's not, democracy's been designed over 5,000 years. There's absolutely tweaks that could be made to it, but it actually works pretty well. What doesn't work so well is us. Like we aren't engaging with it the way it was designed to be engaged with, right? So we either need to fundamentally change our expectations of democracy or we need to become power literate. If we believe fundamentally that we can never hold power or only certain kinds of people hold power or that power is bad and democracy is entirely about, we literally talk about electing people to power, then it will never work for us, right? So we either have to come to accept power in our lives and understand we do have it, even those of us who feel the most powerless, and figure out how to use it effectively in this system that's all about the power of the people, then we might actually have a shot at this, right?
Right.
I haven't given up on the tweaks. I'm still a big proponent. I was a huge proponent for campaign finance reform. I think it's made, in general, a good impact on politics. I think it's going to take a while to shake out at the civic level. Like there's still some negative impacts of campaign finance reform. And I'm a big fan of electoral reform. I think as long as only one person can win, most people will lose, right? And so how do you create a system where most of us can have our votes count in some way rather than the very few?
Right.
Yeah.
So that work that you did around power, like how do you even research that? You just like kind of like read a lot about history?
Amazingly, there is very little work done on power literacy.
I was going to say, like, when you told me that this was the work that you did, I was like, where do you even go for that? Like, I mean, because, it's a lot of it is, like, lived experience. Yeah. And then people documenting their lived experience, which, like, that's pretty uncommon to the public, like, available to the public anyway. Yeah. So, like, you gotta have to, like, dive in and maybe do some interpreting.
Absolutely. And there's definitely, so the thing about power is we think about ourselves 95% of the time, which sounds...
No, that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I stare at my Zoom screen.
But it's a survival strategy, right? It's how we got here. We wouldn't be here having this talk if we only thought about ourselves 10% of the time or 5%. We would have never made it through toddlerhood,
I don't even
right?
know what. Yeah, no, I'd probably be dead, honestly.
Yeah, exactly. So we have if we're not thinking about ourselves, who is, right?
Sure.
So you look after yourself first. You put your own mask on first and then
yes.
other folks,
yes,
right?
Yes, that.
And so of that 95% of the time, a lot of it is spent determining how much power does everyone else have? Yeah. How much power do I have? Right. And how safe am I? What can I get done here, right? Like, am I safe at a basic level? But then within this environment, how much energy should I expend? Because maybe it's not worth me expending any, right? And so the fact that all happens very subconsciously. Yeah. We're not even given language about power, and I'm happy to talk about why that is. But also that because we don't have the language, because it happens self-consciously, and I think critically for the first time in human history, there's no real rigid social structures that power is determined by. Like there's a lot of I'd say there's some hard edges, but there's a lot of fluidity within that. We don't really know what we're walking in. Like, we're just making it up as we go, right? So from that, it's sort of like the Schrodinger's cat time of power. We either have a ton of power or none at all, right? And it's up to us to determine that.
I mean, that's how I feel as like a person that like, I mean, I'm more confident, I'd say, than more like outwardly, more extroverted. So when I walk into a room, I'm like, I'm going to take up all the available power by just like talking loudly and like, meeting everybody. Obviously, that's not like my first thought. Like, I'm going to gobble up all the power, but I'm just saying that like it's available to anybody in my mind. That's like how I've always viewed a room.
But it's so funny. I did this welfare food challenge when I was on city council. It's a long backstory to it, but it was an anti-poverty group that ran it. And so I was very resistant to do it because when I was on welfare and living, especially when I had no access to welfare, when I was too young for that, I would have found a politician doing that to be like very distasteful. But
totally,
this is a group of people who come from that community who really wanted someone who could help them gain exposure for the challenges of living off of what that time was about $18 a week for food. Anyway, did the welfare food challenge. I was like, I can do this. Like, I've done this. I've lived this. No problem. But one of the rules was you couldn't accept help from anyone. You could not get food from anyone. You couldn't go to a food bank. You couldn't go to a soup kitchen. None of those things. Right. And I realized,
oh gosh,
my extroversion, I'm like ridiculously extroverted, was a superpower.
Totally.
And if you're introverted or socially fragile or have like significant, like neurospicy to the point where that just is too much noise for you, you would have none of the food I had, right? It never had occurred to me in that whole time I was living on the streets.
Yeah, like, it's such a privilege to be able to like be comfortable enough to interact with people and ask for things. Yeah. Because like I've had like in my work, there are people that there are people that come through our workshops that just are so used to not taking up space.
Yeah.
Like they're like, I almost didn't sign up for this because I didn't want to take someone else's spot. And I'm like, you take the spot. You want to learn this, you get to have it, you know? Yeah. And this is like, for me, I'm just like, it's such a strange thing because I'm like, you have the power to decide what you want to learn, and then the power to take up that spot or take up that room and space and energy to better yourself. But there's like this like disconnect where people just don't feel like they have that. And like often in feminism, I've noticed people use the term empowered.
Don't like that term.
I hate the word empowered.
I think once in a while it is accurate. So I don't want to like, it's like resilient. Another word I'm not super big on, but I think it's accurate sometimes.
But like, you know, like woman power, like women empowerment. There's no women power. Like that's like, that sounds weird because we don't use that terminology. And I'm just like, what does that mean? Like,
but let's use it.
Yeah, we should. And I'm trying to change that because I think that empowerment just like, it just inherently means that someone's giving us the power. And I'm like, the power comes from inside you. Like you have it already. You just aren't using it, you know?
And from each other, right? Like from holding each other up and no, absolutely. And it is such a, God, one of the things that drives me, it used to really, really irk me. I feel like it's probably bad to disclose this, although I've said it publicly. When I was chairing, I would say it. Because now
Give us
people
a
are
scoop.
like, we know how to irk her. But so when you walk into a space, elected official space, there's like a person chairing the meeting. And so if it's a man, they're called chairperson or chair. If it's a woman, now it's Madam Chair. Because if it's not a man, we have to point out that it's not the right person is there, right? Like we have to gender these terms. And women empowerment is exactly the same thing. We're saying, oh, just by the way, other people, not women, probably men, I'm guessing, are the people giving you this power, right? Letting you have the space to have this power. And it is not cool. So
yeah, going back, sorry, we got on a tangent there.
The language, but this is where having language to talk about power really matters. And so there are a few power literacy folks out there. One of them existed when I was doing my academic work, and one of them I actually met at Harvard, who subsequently was writing her book at the time.
Oh, great.
And has put it out there. So Julie Diamond does some really good work on power literacy. She really looks kind of at like personal power, particularly in a work setting, and she calls it a power print, like a footprint or other kinds of prints. And like, so what is your power print and where do you want to go with it? The one though, if I could only read one book about power literacy, it would be Julie Badalana's, and Tiziana Casciera wrote a book called The Power for All. It has a sub thing like what it is, how to use it to get things done, I think. Anyway, fantastic book. She's Julie is the one that I met at Harvard who was doing the research at the time. And then how else do you learn about power? Well, there's so most work done on power is done by what we would consider high positional power holders. So people with big titles who want to help other people with slightly smaller titles get as big a title. So like,
it sounds so stupid.
I know, but that's what power, if you go out there and try and learn about power, that's largely what you're going to get. But yes, it does sound stupid, right? And then the other work done on power is by people who view themselves as low power holders, trying to tear apart the concept of power rather than develop a relationship with
anarchy.
It. Or just people who feel like, back to that word, empowered, very disempowered. And rather than look at pathways to power, instead are looking at pathways to obliterating the concept of power, which is, in my opinion, like power has always existed. It will, even just the difference between an introvert and an extrovert, right? Like there's always going to be power difference.
Yeah, but there's just like a negative connotation attached to it now. When you say power, people think violence, people think domineering, men.
So the first thing I ask when I'm teaching is give me one word you associate with power. And the word cloud or like
what's the most common then?
Usually like some form of oppression or domination.
Yeah.
Like the idea of power
Dominance.
being done to you, right?
Exactly.
It's very rare that people are able to attach themselves to their own power, and like so they're looking at power coming at them as opposed to power coming out of them. And so there's reasons for this. The people who we would consider those high power holders talking to other slightly less high power holders about holding more power, they don't really want us to have a language. Let's call them the elite, just for the sake of argument.
The Illuminati, yes.
Yeah. They don't really want us to have a language to talk about power.
That's fair.
Because then we might start seeing how much power we have,
might.
Right? And how much they have and what's fair and not fair, right? So there's that. Most of us grew up in households that didn't have those kinds of people in it. So if you were brought up in a prime minister's household or a president's household or a king or queen's, perhaps you do have a healthy, in fact, I would suggest research would suggest you have a good relationship with power. You talked about power. You have healthy ideas about power, generally speaking. Those of us that weren't have very negative ideas about power. And so as a result of that, even if we were given language, we're like, oh no, power is something to avoid because it'll do something bad to you. And so then we also have a feeling that there's certain kinds of people who hold power. And if we aren't those people, again, avoid. And then the worst of the mess is this idea that power corrupts.
Right.
It does not corrupt. The most amazing thing I found in all of my research is that it's such a like weird little side tangent, but that MRI technology, you used to have to go into a machine. Like you could, if we wanted to observe why you thought a certain way or how you were thinking, we had to use behavioral science, which is essentially me looking at you from my perspective going, well, Amanda did that thing because she was angry.
Sure.
Because that's how I would feel in that situation, right?
Right.
MRI technology now is at the point where we can have you doing something and actually see what's happening in your brain and go, oh, actually, that's not what's happening in Amanda's brain at all. So it turns out power doesn't corrupt. It liberates. So if you are a grade A jerk and you get power, you become a powerful grade A jerk. But if you're compassionate, empathic, hardworking person and you get power, you become a powerful, compassionate, hardworking person. And so we really, because we're scared of power, like we've been taught to fear it, we're really good at remembering grade A jerk who has power. We're not so good at remembering the literally thousands of people we've come in contact with who have power, but are using it in compassionate and empathic ways.
That's fascinating. Because, think about all the billionaires right now and all of the choices that they're making. I think it's hard for people. It's a topic of conversation in this moment because it's kind of like I have this fear that I'm like, if I ever get rich, am I gonna just is it gonna turn my brain to mush? Am I just gonna be a butthead? Because I'm just not understanding too much power. Basically, it's gone to my head. But then, now that you're saying that, I'm there's a lot of other people that aren't so, loud-mouthed that, have a lot of money and power, and they don't do that.
Exactly.
So.
There are, so it's not biochemical, which would be the corrupting part.
Sure.
But structurally, there's two things that happen when you have power. The first is that, there's different kinds of power, but largely we're talking about positional power. So you have power over someone else, either through money or title or whatever. The first is that people need things from you. And so they're nicer to you than they are to someone they don't need something from or who can't give them something.
Sure.
And so over time, what happens is, and I think we saw this with Justin Trudeau, frankly, he's spent his whole life being the son of a prime minister or a prime minister, right? And so what happens is people are like, oh, that's great. You look great in blackface. That's awesome.
Right.
So cute, right? But nobody's willing to say,
I know.
That's not at all what you should be doing. It's horrible and offensive, right? And so when that happens over time on big things like that, but also every little thing, everything you do is awesome, right? When I was elected, suddenly I became way more awesome than I am in everyday life.
Right.
I wasn't at all more awesome, but people
I've worked.
You understand.
I've worked with tech bros before that like are you know they're like well respected in their community because everybody knows what they've done and that they have a lot of money, and so no one's calling them out for doing things because they don't want to be like that person to this person that could make or break their career or tell them that they can't work in tech ever again or something like that. So you're just like, I'm just gonna let this slide. That's fine. You go do that problematic behavior that and no one's gonna correct you.
Over time, it's the little ways, it's the big things that are going, you start to believe that, right? Unless, so what we would call hubris, so the first challenge of power, unless you have a way of cultivating humility. And so there's a few ways to do that. One very simple way is to have partners or friend circles that feel like it's okay for them to keep authentic relationships in your life, I think is basically the way. And I always had that when I was elected and was really, it was an intentional strategy to have that circle of people. When people ask me for advice when they want to run for office, I'm like, first thing you do, you find those people. And they can't be people who are there because they want your party to succeed or because they want the city to succeed. They have to be there because they want you to remain an authentic human, right? Yeah. Like, that's who they are.
The honest people that will call you on your BS.
Yeah. And not because they have some other agenda they're furthering.
Exactly.
Right?
They're just truthful. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's really important. But the other one is gratitude. If you take like even 5 minutes every morning or every evening to think about the 1 or 2 or 3 people you're grateful for that day, for whatever it was, it's amazing how much different. It's reminding yourself every day that even though everyone told you how awesome you were awesome because there's, like, in my case, when I was elected, literally thousands of people doing the work to allow the things that I wanted to happen to look awesome, right? So that's super important. And those people were either people at the city or people in the community, my family, like so many people, right? The other thing that happens to you when you have positional power is that, so you, on the one hand, you have the power to reward people, so they're nice to you so that you can do those good things for them. You also have the power to hurt people by, if you're a doctor, you might have to send someone into a surgery that is going to be painful and hard for them to prevent further and greater harm down the road. If you're a prime minister, you have to put soldiers in harm's way to try and prevent greater harm down the road. And so what happens is you have to you have to take your empathy, natural empathy, and actually purposely diminish it. Because if you had high levels of empathy for every single person you had to put in harm's way for the greater good, you wouldn't be able to govern very well. And so if you don't, you have to be able to calibrate empathy, right? Because if you keep it low all the time, we elect people because they have high empathy, but then we kind of watch it disappear in office, and that's largely what's happening, right? Or leaders in companies who are like, oh, that person always just about that, forget, and that's where you're seeing that the empathy is not coming back. And then so the third thing I'd say, humility, empathy, the third thing that research shows that you need to kind of counterbalance the structural challenges of power is purpose. If your only purpose is yourself, and going back to your billionaires, then
my billionaires.
Sorry, the billionaires that we were talking about. That the challenge is, if we see their only purpose is themselves, why are we? And this is a very important concept in power. Most power is socially conferred. We decide you have power. We have decided. I mean, this is the worst part about this. We decided to give Bezos enough money to make him a billionaire, right?
Yeah, of course.
I live in an apartment building. I go home every night and see the pile of packages that contribute to his billionaireness, right? These are choices we've made. And so, while we're not responsible for the choices he's now making with that money, we've contributed to the power that he has. And we can conversely decide that we no longer want to do that.
And then there's also people that prey on our, on people's inability to make better choices when it comes to maybe the way that their consumerism, I just think that it's like so hard for people nowadays who are struggling so hard to like pay grocery bills and to like with like childcare and all these things. And then like it's like then they feel so guilty for buying some like diapers on Amazon because they don't want to like give the money to him. But then
Yeah.
also we live in a structure in a society where that is like the best and easiest thing that they can do. They like are almost forced into that. And it's like it's exhausting.
It is
You know what I
exhausting.
mean? Like everyone should just like make the choices that they can and are willing to make in that moment. But it's also like, what recourse is there with the way that we're being squeezed from like all sides now when it comes to like capitalism specifically? That's a whole nother thing.
Consumer habits aren't going to solely deal with billionaires. We've collectively, both through our political like policy decisions as well as our purchasing decisions, allowed a world in which these billionaires exist.
Oh yeah.
And the ability to deal with them isn't just going to be about withdrawing what we're purchasing from, right?
Totally.
There are absolutely public policy interventions, taxes. Let's just call them what they are, taxes that need to exist, that allow wealth that is being drawn from poor communities into billionaires to be redistributed back to poor communities, and a whole bunch of other public policy solutions that need to exist, not just to like level off the billionaires, but to raise the tide for folks who have no hope of ever being billionaires. I mean, are just, as you say, just struggling to survive. So I don't want to sound like the solution is just for us to all stop buying from Amazon. But I guess more the point that when I was born in the 70s, maybe a better example would be my grandmother, who was born in the early 1900s. At that point in human history, pretty much the only way to be I'm guessing a millionaire, but what would have been the equivalent in wealth to a billionaire now, would be to inherit it.
Right.
That has changed, and it's changed because we're all able to participate in the economy in much higher ways.
Right.
And other people are like extracting the value that we're putting into the economy. So that's sort of like the fundamental shift. It's not that this wealth accumulation is different. It's the ways that people are accumulating it that's different.
No. Yeah, I totally understand that.
They used to just steal it. Now we like, no, please have it.
I mean, they're stealing people's will. Like I feel, you know, like they're sort of it's predatory in my opinion, like and manipulative. What are our human animal brains supposed to do when we're inundated with marketing ads 24/7 and you know we're looking for dopamine and serotonin and we can't find it, but we're in front of a screen all day? I mean, it's really like we're a bit powerless in that sense.
But this is where like, so the language of power, there's some research that was done, in the 1950s, believe it or not, that outlines these 5 bases of power. And I came across that and so use that as a bit of the foundation of the work that I do. And it sounds like, oh God, Andrea, that'd be so archaic. But honestly, like, what are we, 80 years later here? It's still the most durable research that's been done and looks at power in a work setting, in a social setting, in a community setting, looked across what they would have understood as a complete gender spectrum at the time, which was men and women.
Right.
Looks at different ages, different races, and comes up with these 5, what I would think of as sort of like the ABCs of power. So there's positional power, which we've been talking about a lot. There's reward power, which is oftentimes, if you have positional power, you probably have the ability to reward people, but there's other ways. Love is a reward, validation, seeing someone, inviting someone onto the podcast. Like it makes you feel like you have something that matters to say, right?
Sure.
There's coercive power, which is the opposite of reward power, but we also, the police and army we give them pure kind of coercive power in exchange for enforcing laws and borders respectively. Those first 3 types are the socially conferred ones. So what that means is that those powers only matter because we believe they matter and we decide collectively. So reward power, you could offer me a trip to Las Vegas. that's no reward. It's not interesting to me, right? So you have no power over me
Right.
in that regard. But if you asked me if I wanted to go hang out with a group of amazing women in an incredible space and just like
Right.
connect and learn from each other, that's a huge reward, right? That
Sure.
would be amazing. I would love to do that.
Yeah.
And so reward power is it's relative. The other two types they talk about are expert power. So being an expert on
Right.
something, right? I think a lot of the work you do really is about democratizing expert power,
Yes.
which is super cool. And so expert power, referent power, which is when you were talking about extroversion, that's a form of referent power. Your ability to make friendships, your ability to build networks, but really importantly, your ability to energize networks. And then the sixth kind of power is one that I've added in, and through the academic work that I've done, have really seen that there is a power, which we also talked about earlier, which I call refusing powerlessness. And this is like, so maybe you don't have any of the other five, no positional power, no reward, no coercion, no expertise that's relevant in the context, and no, inherent ability to build a network or energize it. But you do have the ability to believe your own truth. And so even if someone is saying you're nothing or you're less than or you're not important in the situation, believing that you are is its own kind of power that can help you access the other kinds of power.
Yeah, I think there's so much power in that. Because like you live in your own reality, like your perspective, right? Yeah. It's your life. And so the way you get to choose how you feel, that's really like rudimentary. And I feel like I'm glossing over a lot of like nuances of what it is to be like alive. But there's nothing more peaceful than knowing like what your power is and like your truth, who you are, which is like why a lot of my work is centered around like, we're trying to meet you where you are. You're not good at this thing. None of us are good at this thing. Like you can just be like confident in your inability to do this thing and then own that and then meet yourself where you're at and then be at peace with that. And then I feel like, I'm not a psychologist, but I just feel like something happens to your brain where it's just more open.
So super cool. And I'm happy to send you the research. It totally does.
Yeah.
That when we assume powerless identities, we become there's tons of research that shows your body language, your overall health, like physical health, mental health starts to decline. And conversely, if you refuse powerlessness, the opposite happens, right? Like you literally glow. And it's not just for you, it's for the people who are like back to those social connections. So when we were talking earlier about being empowered, refusing powerlessness is sort of the opposite of it's the same outcome as I think the people who use the word empower mean, but it's like then owned by the person who's actually responsible for the action, right? Who has the power to make those decisions.
Have you read Hidden Potential?
No.
It's really good.
Okay.
It's really good because he actually talks a lot about that and like how people learn and how like kids specifically learn and how the environments need to be like in a place where they can feel calm so that and have fun and like how they can absorb information so much easier in that kind of way. Anyway, again, we could talk forever about this. Yeah. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here today. Like, let me just wrap up that kind of segment of what we just talked about. Like, where are you at with your? I mean, you finished the fellowship and right, and then now you're teaching.
Yeah, during the fellowship, I developed this sort of like prototype, I guess, for I'll say a class, but I'm much more of a trainer. I'm a very experiential learning focused person. And so it's not very what they call Socratic. Like I'm not like, read these things and I'll ask you questions about it.
Right.
It's like, read these things and now let's practice doing these things.
Sure.
Right? The first thing I teach classes in a number of different UBC and SFU and Public Policy Institute, and I do guest seminars and lectures and stuff. And the first thing I always have people do is I ask them words they associate with power. Then I make them connect in small groups and decide who's the most powerful person in that group. And honestly, they learn more from that, like literally 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And then the debrief than I could ever give them readings to read about and then quiz them on.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. So a lot of what I always think of in my head is that because we're thinking about power all the time and our own power and others, it's really, my job is like kind of unpeeling the onion, not like helping them build an onion. I'm trying to help them unlearn all this negative stuff they've learned about power. There is like fantastic and good reasons for having a healthy understanding of power. And in some cases, I wouldn't say fearing it, but respecting it for sure. But to that end, like, why not respect your own power and develop a good relationship with it? And power can be used in very negative ways, your own power, right? So being aware of it is another way of making sure that doesn't happen. So I, over the last 5 years, have been sort of honing this curriculum, trying to like test things out and figure out the best ways to bring it to people and like what needs to be there for people. It's a pretty unsettling thing to develop a relationship with your own power. So how do I make it? I'm hesitating on the word safe because I don't feel like it's a safe exercise, but it's intended to be disruptive. It's intended to like bring you out of a comfort zone into a discomfort zone, but hopefully in service of you having the power you need to be able to influence the systems that are creating challenges, oppressions, barriers, the circumstances in people's lives we've been talking about in ways that are the fastest pathways to change, right? That's what this work has always been about for me, whether it's climate change or reconciliation or income inequality or stronger community connections, whatever it is. So I have the classroom work. This year, I really decided I wanted to start taking it out of the classroom. I was really encouraged by some I still have that great group of people who give me honest, authentic feedback. And so I've been doing these little Power You videos online. I did a community power game day. We play a role-playing game. And that's really fun. And then been trying to do more of my consulting practice, like really offer people whatever I can, whether they're public sector agencies, governments, some mission-driven businesses or business associations, like more professional associations, trying to help them understand power and then how to take the tools they're learning and use them to navigate power to get to make change happen faster.
That's wonderful. I think that's like so interesting and not a perspective that I see very often. So I will be calling you about a workshop in the future.
Amazing.
Okay. I don't want to take up a ton more of your time, but we do have like a lightning round of just like some really like random questions that everybody gets asked. What has been your favorite age?
Oh, I love those questions. I would say, if it wasn't for the pandemic, probably like the early 50s, because I turned 50 during the pandemic. I think like just the career is such a weird word to attach to my work because I feel like it's just what I'm doing.
You're like, I'm just doing things. I don't know career.
But like, I just feel like I don't have to explain. There's this quote about a woman who needs no validation from others is the most powerful person in the world. I feel like that's when I hit that zone. But I would say like in terms of just sheer badassness, like probably mid-40s were pretty amazing.
I'm so stoked to hear that. I'm gonna get there.
I mean the 20s and 30s, I've had an amazing life, so it's hard for me to like, I had my kid at 25. That was super amazing. I did in the 30s, I got elected, you know, for the first time just before I turned 30, and then was elected to council in my mid-30s. Anyway, there's lots of amazing things.
Totally, and it's always a hard question for everybody. But I just, I like to ask because I'm just, I don't know, aging is such a like taboo subject, especially amongst women. And I just kind of like want people to understand that like, actually most of the guests that I've interviewed have been like, now or like, you know,
really
like later on in my life, you know, like the early years were kind of nightmarish, you know, not knowing and not being confident in anything you're doing. And it's like so nice to hear that it gets like so much better and you get so much more like comfortable with yourself. What is the best part about being a woman in your industry?
You know, being a woman in politics and public policy is, I'm not going to lie straight up, It's pretty bad. Like the kind of
No, I couldn't believe that. Really? It's bad? Of course it's bad.
I spend so much time trying to convince more women to run or
yeah,
people
but you're like, it's hard, but you should because you have, you know,
if
we
we're
need
not
it.
there, it never changes, right? But
Yeah.
I think what I've really sort of come to is what I see a group of us doing now, and we've all done it independently, although we stay connected to each other as we're kind of doing it. We're like, well, screw this. If the box doesn't work for us, we're just going to make our own box and we're going to bring you over here, right? And so the work I'm doing now, it's pretty like weird. Like there's not a lot of people doing it, right? And I look over and see someone like Param Kalan, who's got this, and Opreet Kang. They're, you know, both women who've been very involved in policy and politics.
We talk all the time, actually.
Awesome. Okay,
Actually, I need to get Parm on the podcast.
You got to get Parm on the podcast.
Yeah, I know.
But they're doing the same. Like they're not trying to do what men do better or differently or woman-owned versions of that. We're trying to do something totally different. I ran a campaign last year for a nomination. You know, we lost by 12 votes, which is hard. It's a lot harder than losing by like,
oh my God,
1,000 votes or something.
Oh, that's so heartbreaking.
Well, yeah, and there was a bunch of other circumstances. But anyway, it was a great exercise in power and privilege and how that all works. But I ran the campaign I have always wanted to run, right? And the folks involved in it, although somewhat bitter about the circumstances of the losing, were so, I still, like, over a year later, still have people being like, that was an amazing campaign. So we're just building things the way we want to build them. And maybe we're not winning yet in the world that men and people who are attaching themselves to powerful men are winning, but we're doing it our way. And I think that's part of what I don't think everyone can do it. I think the front is long, as a friend of mine says, but I think those of us who are at an age where we feel comfortable, confident, it's amazing to be able to do this.
Yeah, I think being a woman that works in like for herself and has her own business, it's very intimidating because like I don't have a business degree. Like I never thought that I'd own my own business, and so like I've always been very self-conscious of like calling it even my business, you know? And so like there's like a lot of rules in place or things that you learn in business school. And listening to other female founders talk about their journey around their businesses, they just try to do things really differently. Meaning like you're not like asking for investment from like 2 people, which is like what the recommendation is like not to ask like a lot of people for investment because then you have to like manage all the people. Yeah. But then I'm like, women are great at managing like multiple people, you know, like a community of people. Yeah. Let's like pool all of our money to have investment. And like that's just not the way that men do it. But then women might do it completely differently. And I'm like, just because it's different doesn't mean that it's wrong. And so like kind of reminds me of what you're saying, which is that like it's hard because we're working with this like system that's already been built and we're like very, very obviously like running up against the thing that isn't working for us and trying to change it. But there's no rule for you to like not do that, right?
And that's the refusing powerlessness,
yeah.
Right? You can either accept that powerless identity and try and make it work in this other system. I think there's another way that I've seen women try to do it where they try to build the carbon copy of the men's thing, but women are in charge.
Right.
But I would argue that the problem isn't that men are in charge. It's that the structures don't accommodate or serve the needs that we have as women or gender diverse people or Black people or people living with different abilities. Like these structures are made for a very particular group of folks. Yes. And it's not about us being at the top of them. It's about us rejecting them and building structures that work for greater numbers of people. That's a pretty amazing place to be.
Yeah. That's great. What's the worst part about? I guess like that is also like
the worst part. The hours are a little long, but I don't mind that at all. Yeah, it's why like words like career or even work are challenging because it's my work is my life and my life is my work. And it's not because I'm a workaholic. It's that it's the membrane between my personal, my political, my community is pretty thin.
I can relate.
Yeah. But it feels amazing too, right? Like it's sort of like being embraced within a community. Like there's always this structure around you, right? but what is the worst part? I am like, to go from this lovely, nurturing discussion to a very hard task, I'm in this very difficult decision point about, do I grow the business? Do I what does it mean to stay where I am?
This is all like also embedded like growth mindset that's been like just very, I don't know, like almost insidiously like planted in our brains where we like are like, no, we gotta grow. We gotta keep growing, grow.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are like, oh, you should grow Bad Academy, grow it. And I'm just like, I don't wanna. Is it okay if I just don't, I just move at the pace that I want to? So there's like this anxiety that you're like, oh, maybe I'm not doing enough. Should I be doing more? Like, should I do less? Like,
I totally, I could bring power to so many more people if I grew and created a brand and no. But I also feel like my job is to scatter seeds, not to necessarily hover over them and water them and grow them. And I just,
It's true. Not seeing the impact, like, that you're making waves and that you're changing people's minds, and at least planting seeds. And you just sometimes don't get to see what the impact is. But then when you do get to see it, that's like the best part of my job.
Kind of amazing too. I'm really fortunate that the teaching is amazing because I do have students come back. Now I've been teaching for 5 years. My business is 5 years old.
Yeah.
So I do get to see what happened, even if I wasn't the one tending over it. But my whole thing is about power, right? And so if I was there hovering over, that's the wrong thing to learn about power, right? That it's all about me and me doing all the stuff, right?
Yeah. Okay, last question is if you only had 5 minutes to teach someone something about your work, what would it be?
Oh, that's tough because people have spent literally decades in many cases learning really awful things about power. I think the simplest exercise that I can give anyone is to have them go downtown or somewhere where there's a lot of people on the street, Metrotown, choose a place where there's people coming at you and pay attention, refuse to give up space and pay attention.
Oh my God, I do this all.
To who runs into you and who doesn't and who's angry about running into you and who's not. And you will learn a lot about embedded power structures as well as your own idea about what your space is, right?
Yeah, sometimes when I'm walking downtown, down a crowded sidewalk, I won't move. I'll just walk straight and I'll see a man walking towards me and I'm like, I'm not moving. Let's see who moves out of the way first. So it's just it's like a game of chicken that this man has no idea that we're playing. And then he just collides with me. I mean, how many times does that happen? Honestly, and they just don't even see me. They don't see people. And I'm just like, this is crazy because when I'm out in public, I'm very aware of my surroundings and how I'm affecting people. I'm a very I always use my blinker kind of thing when I'm driving.
But you're a woman, you're a racialized woman, visibly racialized. Right. So you're younger.
I know, but it's crazy that people have that a completely different reality that I do.
If it was an Indigenous man, he'd probably get out of the way.
Right.
If it was an Indigenous man or a Latino or Black man coming from a construction site, they'd probably get out of your way, but they may not for an Indigenous woman.
Right.
So it maybe the last point, so in that 5 minutes, I'd get them to go do that and be like, if you think power doesn't exist or this is the living physical space embodiment of it. But then the other thing is this concept, where do privilege and power collide? Well, so privilege is literally defined as having more power than you have responsibility for that power. And so for you to consider, I've had a few white guys run into me while performing this exercise, showing people how it works. What is his responsibility in that moment, right? But then conversely, who are you not getting out of the way for because you have the privilege to do that? Power is completely contextual. And what's your responsibility, right? And that, I think, is the starting place with power.
Fascinating. Yeah. Thank you for being here today.
It was so great. This was awesome. Thanks for bringing me on.
Yeah, of course. All right. Yeah. Well, thanks so much. And let's plan a workshop.
Yeah, I would love to do a workshop with Bad Academy.
Great. All right. Stay bad.